Yes. Thank you very much. I thank both speakers for these interesting talks, and we do have time for discussion and questions. Okay, so anyone? Jose, please.
I wanted to ask you, in your presentation of the futurist representation of movement, and to draw it to Naamah's book is called Subjectivity in Motion. Would it be a complete misunderstanding that the representation in fact shows futurism as a kind of motion without subjectivity? That's actually the way I saw the pictures, and I would like you to correct me. In very many ways they use the terms dismantle, and I would apply to that, dismantle subjectivity. Or does it come back in a way in which I did not see it?
I think that in a way it goes back to subjectivity, because it does start, it is very much related at the beginning to subjectivity. For instance, I'm thinking about the states of mind by Boccioni, and really they are called states of mind because it is the let's say the states of emotion and subjectivity related to a specific situation in which is the departure at the train station. So I think that at the beginning they really depart, the futurists really depart from subjectivity, which is related, I would say, to emotion, and then afterwards they try to, let's say, to dismantle the scheme of the idea of painting by taking, let's say, taking a leave from that situation, from that particular background, I would say.
May I say something?
Sure,
also,
with pleasure.
Yeah. But would it be possible to say that, in fact, it's a sort of reinforcement of subjectivity? Because when Boccioni says to put the spectator at the center of the painting, so there is a sort of possibly a sort of anti-Albertian argument. But insofar as the spectator is not outside the painting, so the window metaphor doesn't work. Actually, I wonder whether in that painting the city enters the window. There's not a sort of anti-Albertian.
I think in a way it is what you're saying is absolutely true. It is right, but it is this idea of having a different vision of the place of the spectator, and it's not anymore the viewer which has, as you say, an Albertian perspective. So it is not the painting which is which has how would you say frame, yes. But on the contrary, it is the spectator which at this point is inside the painting and which lives the life of the painting, so emotionally and let's say, and also is forced and thrust into the painting. I would say. I think. Hope I have answered.
Do you have another question?
Well, I wanted to ask a similar question to your presentation. I mean, double-blind experiments try to also, to dismantle the subjectivity of the person who is involved, both the experimenter, the person who is administering the medication. They should not have any subjectivity that could influence the experiment in any way, and the person who are being administered the medicine, their subjectivity is also in a way, I think, neutralized. They should not know what they're being given because they could project in some way an effect on the medication that is not an objective one. So in the end, we are left only with one subjectivity, which is the experimenter outside the whole thing, the only person who really knows what's going on, but he has no contact with the person. So I thought there was a similarity, but obviously there isn't. But that, in fact, you know, in a way, you say the spectator is in the picture in the futurist painting, but in a way, by putting the spectator there, I felt that my subjectivity as a spectator is being dismantled, because it's somehow no longer left to me. And I felt that in double-blind experiments, also my subjectivity is being dismantled. It is no longer effective in any way.
I wouldn't agree at all. I wouldn't agree. No, because actually my final argument was that in that kind of model, the blind spot is not included. The blind spot of the person who is conducting the experiment. So the fact that he has no physical contact with the nurses or the researchers doesn't matter, because actually the problem, in my view, would be to include the blind spot, and so to reflect on the double-blind experiment as a sort of incomplete model. So it's very challenging, but also incomplete. And I think that in a way, a self-criticism, which in my view should be part of the historian's reflection, can be regarded as a sort of inspiration for the double-blind experiment, which is at the same time challenging but incomplete.
I wanted to ask you to comment on your point. Going back to the article by Naamah that I mentioned at the beginning, where she makes a parallel between the historian craft and the way in which case studies or case reports of psychiatrists share the point of storytelling. And I wanted to ask you if you don't find this analogy more appropriate for the kind of point that you are trying to do, precisely because in both cases here you have people or professionals, let's say, trying to define the idiosyncratic in each of the cases that they are trying to deal with, whereas the medical experiment is trying to formulate some kind of general law, to the extent that medical claims are general, rather than looking on the particular case of the patient. And in Naamah's comparison, I think that she's looking at something that makes more sense from the point of view of comparison.
Okay, I think that I certainly accept Naamah's idea that case studies are very instructive for historians. Maybe I would not accept your comment on this, because I would say, okay, let's look at the medical tradition. In the medical tradition, as I said very briefly in my presentation, there is a tension from the Corpus Hippocraticum onwards between cases and, let's say, general, let's say, the idea of an illness. So there is the tension between something which is individual, extremely specific symptoms, so a case, and then a drive towards generalization, an illness. So this tension should not be abandoned, in my view. And certainly, I mean, I think that even, let's say, Naamah's book shows this very well, because, I mean, you have a case, but then there is how it's possible to interpret this case. And so there is something which implies some kind of generalization. This seems to me a first point. The second point of disagreement, if I may say, is about storytelling. Okay, certainly. I mean, the storytelling is involved, but if this implies that everything is, let's say, a story, and there is no difference between historia in all possible senses, all possible meanings, and storytelling,
no.
I don't agree.
No, I didn't mean that, because in both cases we have people who are trying to tell a story that is connected to evidence, at least in the way that you are telling it, and I, of course, fully agree that there is evidence to deal with and so on, but the kind of evidence that the double-blind experiment is trying to gather as compared to the kind of evidence that the historian or the psychiatrist that is telling this story about this specific patient is trying to say. I think here the relationship is closer, and not in the sense of an invented story, on the contrary,
Okay.
that it has to do with evidence.
Okay.
Also the judge that you mentioned.
No, I agree. At that moment, I agree. So I would say, okay, there is an analogy between, let's say, working on historical cases, because I wouldn't say that all kind of history is comparable to case studies, but certainly some kind of history learned a lot, and I can certainly speak about myself from, for instance, Freud's case studies. So what's the meaning of this? Meaning, let's say, working on a case implies some kind of cognitive tools which can be used by historians as well. I agree. On the other hand, there is the generalization involved even in Freud's case. I mean, in my view, a case implies generalization, and I would say the other way around as well. In other words, a sort of global historical reconstruction which would not take into account a case study perspective would be weak, extremely weak.
Okay.
When I think about the blind spot of the
Yeah.
designer of the experiment, I
Yeah.
was trying to think what you mean by this. And the kind of thing, in the double-blind experiment, in this particular context, and the kind of thing that I was thinking about was that one of the things that can happen is how you design the placebo and how you design the experiment as a whole. For example, the color of the pills that you're using, the way that the doctors dress, all these kind of things can have a profound effect on the difference between the effect of the placebo and the effect of the non-placebo. Is this what you had in mind? Is this the kind of blind spot that you had in mind?
Okay, thank you very much for your question, and I would like to answer with a sort of extreme case, because I think extreme cases are extremely...
You can obliterate the placebo. Not the placebo, you can obliterate.
No,
you can make the placebo work 100%.
My answer would be a sort of fictitious case which would be really extreme. Meaning, instead of using, let's say, using water, but the water is polluted. So the blind spot would imply a lack of perception of the pollution in the water. Now, this lack of perception can be due to, let's say, inadvertency, ignorance, corruption, all kinds of motives. So I think the blind spot is a strong reality which should be taken into account at all possible levels, including the higher level in which there is the person who is conducting the experiment. So I think the, let's say, finding the blind spot in the double-blind experiment seems to me absolutely important. It's not a sort of fictitious fantasy. No, I'm not, I mean, it's not polemical. I'm trying to clarify the implications of what I said. In other words, this is not an addition to a model. It seems to me a strong criticism of a model which, in principle, does not imply the recognition of blind spots. Thank you.
The analogy between what goes on in laboratory, the court of law, and the historian study has to be historicized on all three levels, of course, because the very notions of evidence and relevance, I mean, that obviously goes without saying. But then there seem to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, a kind of two categorical division between the story, the hypothesis, the theory, and the evidence. The cathedral is a quaint and funny example, the windows. But if one looks, for example, this is something, and excuse the rude example, but it actually has to do with Jewish law by the end of the day. Because the medical theory was that in the male member, the urine and the sperm go through different ducts, Leonardo actually drew I mean, he performed a dissection and saw two ducks because they had to be two ducks. Now, nobody performing that kind of dissection today would see two ducks. Now, there's so you know, evidence can't be teased apart, of course, from theory so easily. In fact, they're dramatically intertwined and historical. And I won't, of course, quote the cheese and the worms. I mean, the notion of evidence there and theory there.
I completely agree with you, but I started from Gombrich's example because it's an extreme example. So, I mean, you immediately see what his point is. On the other hand, I agree with you, there are a lot of, let's say, there is a gray zone with full of, let's say, extremely complicated intermediate cases. But I think that the Gombrich's point is important because we have to, I mean, we must try to disentangle theory, our theory, from the evidence in order to find our blind spot. Because otherwise, I mean, there would be only storytelling. So I think that, let's say, behind, let's say, Gombrich's point, the blind spot analogy, the criticism of the blind spot, the double-blind analogy, and so on, there is this simple idea, as I said at the beginning, referring to Gombrich, that something like truth, and I would say without quotation marks, truth and reality, well, this exists. What do I mean by saying without quotation marks? I know that actually there must be a subject in order to perceive reality. But if science as a project, and this is the very center of Naamah's book, if science as a project, as a meaning, we have to keep that distinction in mind and try to work on it. Because otherwise, that is only storytelling.
But that very distinction is framework dependent and historically
dependent. Yeah, okay. But then we have to try to historicize our historical perception. So it's a sort of endless, asymptotic, I would say, asymptotic procedure.
Yes, please.
I have a question for Esther Point. I think the talk was really interesting because it undermines some of the most common perceptions of futurism. And one of them is, of course, the centrality of the spectator in the feature. But also you spoke with this very poetic language about this intuition of form, the appearance of form, of the synesthetic reality, which is almost presence there. So are you somehow diffusing the kind of radical break of this avant-garde, or personally, because historians, you try and avoid this narrative of rupture and go back to some notions that maybe even not.
No, thank you for the for your question, which it's still, let's say, it's still a problem that I'm coping with. It's not, I haven't solved it. I don't think it is solvable in a way. I think that the aim, the futurist's aim, was to break form and to try and find. I read the 1911 phrase by Boccioni because it's really quite radical. The idea of to not having painting anymore but gas. In 1911, it's absolutely unthinkable of, I would say. But the problem is how this extreme idea, which is conceptually certainly more extreme than Cubism, I would say, and more extreme than any other avant-garde, but it doesn't show as extreme when it comes to painting, when it comes to the work of art. So there you have. This is why I was talking before about Picasso, and I just mentioned Picasso because Picasso is certainly more radical formally. But if you think of it in, let's say, in theoretical, from a theoretical point of view, he's less extreme because he works inside the idea of genre. I was telling about genres before. If you think about it, during the Cubist period, he works with landscapes, portraiture, and still life. The three genres of painting, no? And this is Picasso.
Yeah.
Certainly not. Sorry.
Yeah. No, but I would think that maybe it would be possible to see, because I completely agree with you, but I wonder whether it would not be possible to let's say, make the argument not in terms of genre, but at a formal level. Because it seems to me that in both cases there is a very strong connection with Art Nouveau. But in the case of Boccioni, Art Nouveau, because of that painting showing gases, I mean, it's pure Art Nouveau in a sense.
More Boccioni than Picasso.
Yeah, but I think about la période bleue. So, I mean, there is a rupture in the case of Picasso, which in a way didn't take place in the case of Boccioni. So there is a continuity, it seems to me. I'm not an art historian, but it seems to me that the continuity with its Art Nouveau roots are more evident in the case of Boccioni.
In Boccioni, certainly, yes, they are.
So in Picasso there is this break.
There is
no break in the case of Boccioni, it seems to me.
No,
yeah, okay.
There is no break.
Yeah.
This is what but there is a break conceptually. What I was saying is this, that conceptually Boccioni thinks about abstraction, about the abstraction of speed, about the abstraction of motion, the abstraction of gas, for instance. Not Picasso, because Picasso is working really on the level of paint, inside the idea of painting. Formally, let's say, in a way. But at the same time, sorry, excuse me, but Boccioni doesn't make doesn't go further ahead in a way.
But then I wanted to ask you really about evidence in this case, in the sense whether you have some evidence about any way in which someone like Boccioni would be aware, or even mistakenly, about the new theories of space and time.
Oh yes, he certainly was.
Because I say it because similar arguments have been done about Picasso, but then evidence is to the contrary, at best. So I wanted to know a little bit more if you can say something about Boccioni in this case. Whether
no, there certainly was this idea. Well, okay, they didn't read in depth any kind of scientific book or any kind of scientific theory, but they were all those theories were well known. They would
because
yes,
there has been some confusion. You mentioned the fourth dimension, which is certainly important, and this was an idea that was very prevalent at the time, not coming from the theory of relativity, but from people like all kind of strange people in the 19th century talking about that. And again, if this is the kind of point that you are raising, I understand what you mean, but I'm not sure about anything deep. I mean, I think one should be careful separating between the fourth dimension that enter relativity in a different way than to speak about the theory of relativity itself, and of course,
sure.
Einstein,
but obviously, excuse me. No. Thank you for bringing up this point. But certainly, I don't think that it's more an intuitive perception. It's certainly not reading in depth the 1905 theory of relativity, or the first. Let's say theory of relativity. No, in no way. But the fact that in 1909 Marinetti says that time and space died yesterday. It's not by just by pure chance.
Yeah. Any other question? Okay. So I think it's time to thank again our speakers.
Thank you.
And thank you.